Thank you all so much for joining us. And I know that other participants will continue to come in. But one of the things that we always try to do is to honor everyone's time and attention. We know that there are a lot of places you could be at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. And there might even be some places you'd rather be at this moment, maybe even having dinner. But we are so grateful for the gift of your time and presence as we enter into this holy time of learning with one another. So thank you. Thank you for the gift of your presence. My name is Beth Chrisman, and it is truly my honor and blessing to serve as the district superintendent in the Uwharrie district, and also as the director of Peace Building Ministries for the Western North Carolina Conference. My producer is also my wonderful husband, Kelly, who is helping me this evening as well. Many of you know him also. And part of what you'll be learning today is from a lot of the work and training that Kelly and I did and have done for many years, since 2003. I cannot believe it's been 21 years ago that we began and founded the nonprofit ministry of Plowpoint. So the handout and the material that we'll be looking at today is mostly from Longing to Belong, but also incorporates several other of our publications. But I'll make sure we have time at the end of our session this evening for questions and conversation, and always welcome a continued dialogue and partnership with each other. I would love to begin by offering a word of prayer, and then Kelly, I'll also, after that, I'll offer for you if you have any other technical instructions you want to give us. We'll be open to that. But friends, let's pray. Well, good and gracious God, we are truly thankful for the gift of your presence with us this evening, knowing, Lord, that long before we gathered in this time and space, knowing that it is sacred time and space because you've gone before us and prepared the way. We just ask that your spirit would continue to work among us. We give you thanks for the gift of technology that allows us to connect in these ways, so that as we grow in your word, we also grow in our life and ministry with one another. So, Holy Spirit, have your way with us. We ask that your hedge of protection would be around this technology on which we depend, but that it would never keep us from the deep and abiding relationships we have with you and with one another. All of this we pray in your holy and gracious name. Amen. Amen.
Well, good evening, everyone. I had to have a refresher class this afternoon on Zoom. We got so used to it and accustomed, and I knew how to do everything when that's all we were doing. But then when we moved to Greensboro, I had two small churches, and we just had meetings in person because we could scatter around the sanctuary. And I hadn't been on Zoom in a long time. So I just had to remind myself of all the little buttons you could push to change the view of how we can look at everybody. But I think the main thing, if you've got the handout, I did email it to you, and it's in the chat, and that's what Beth's going to talk about and point to. And I can put it on the screen, but I think she'd rather actually look at folks and so we can actually talk to each other and work our way through all this. But I can put it on the screen if that will help anybody.
Yeah, I think it will. I think I'd like us to be able to do that, Kelly, just in case someone does not have the handout or is not able to download it. And some people, in case you're on a tablet or a phone, it may be difficult to look at more than one thing at a time as well.
And I'm gonna put my email in the chat, but it's the conference email. So you can always contact me any time later after this, and I can send things to you.
Great, very good. Well, we will go ahead and get started. One thing about the handout is everything we're going to discuss this evening is actually on the handout. One of the things that we have learned over the years is by giving you a robust handout. Hopefully you have a lot of critical information that will help you moving forward. And we also try to produce and put in your hands something that you can refer back to, including practical tools that you can implement right away in your life and ministry with each other. Some of you have been part of our other teachings before, so you may find as we start in some of our teaching this evening that there will be some of this that sounds very familiar, but you also may encounter new content this evening as well. We like to begin, and I will start this evening sharing with you the 4 stages of group or team formation. These are probably very familiar to most of you. As many of you have heard me teach before, I did not develop these 4 stages. They were actually developed in 1970 by an educator by the name of Bruce Tuckman. And Bruce Tuckman developed the 4 stages of group formation as a model. He initially designed it as a linear model that all groups of people would go through these 4 stages of their life and work together. I encountered it when I was a healthcare consultant many years ago. But when we began the ministry of Plowpoint, I wanted to see if, first and foremost, these 4 stages were rooted in Scripture. And I found that they were, that we go through these 4 stages, and that throughout Scripture, the groups that were described in their life and ministry with one another also went through these 4 stages. But what I found, friends, was that it wasn't a linear model. It's actually a cyclical model, because people go through these 4 stages not just once, but we do it over and over and over again. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to remind us of the 4 stages, because it's going to set the context for the rest of our conversation. That is the focus for us tonight, and that is the importance of healthy boundaries for fruitful ministry. So the first stage that every group of people go through, including how we have begun to gather tonight for our work together, is we begin by forming as a group. And in our forming, we really focus on who we are and whose we are. And oftentimes we do that through our storytelling. Just this evening, we did some introductions with one another. I began by sharing just a little bit of my story with you. Seeing many of you on our Zoom call this evening, many of you are part of our story, so we can spend a lot of time that helps us form even more deeply. I will say of the 4 activities, or excuse me, of the 4 stages, forming is often the stage that most groups of people devalue the most. We often will think to ourselves, and thank you, Winnie, for doing some of that forming by introducing yourself in the chat. But oftentimes we think, you know what, I don't know that we have time to focus on that forming. And yet our experience is that if we do not take the sacred time and space to form well as a group, we're not going to be able to effectively navigate through the other 3 stages. So make sure you take valuable time to form. Anytime a group changes, you need to come back and spend the time of forming to really get to know who you are and whose you are. Because inevitably, the second thing that happens within any group is we will eventually start to storm. Now, what does it mean to storm? We will start to articulate differing views, opinions, wishes, needs, and desires. Another word for storming, of course, is conflict. The Latin word for conflict, confligere, means to strike together. And there will eventually be a time in every relationship among every group of people where we'll have differing views, opinions, wishes, needs, and desires that strike together. And as we're going to talk about tonight, as we talk about the importance of boundaries, storming is not what harms us. It's how we navigate through the storms. And as we're going to really dive in this evening, we're going to talk about the importance of boundaries that really help protect the nature and the magnitude, the function of the group, of being able to navigate through the storms. Without boundaries, we tend to get off course very quickly. Because once we're able to effectively navigate through the storms, it helps refine our understanding of what we're about. And that leads us to the third stage of norming. In the norming stage, we agree on those essentials that really do clarify what we're about, our mission, our vision, our core values. And by the way, you might think, gosh, do all groups of people have a mission, a vision, and a core values? And I can assure you they do. Every family has a mission, has a purpose for which you exist. Every family has some sense of vision where they're headed. It might be short-sighted, it might be a long view. And every family has a set of core values that really help clarify why and how you do things. When groups of people get in trouble is when they don't know what's guiding their actions, because we all have these almost like operating systems going on behind the scenes that make us decide what we will do, what we don't do, what we invest in, what we don't invest in. Does this make sense? So it's really important to be intentional of clarifying the norming within a group. Yes, this is what we're about. But it's also the point in our journey where we also say, but this is what we are not about. Okay. This is what we are about, and this is what we're not about. And once a group starts to norm, then we move on to the fourth stage and we perform. We start to put the mission, the vision, the core values into action that makes the decision of what we are going to invest in, what we're not going to invest in. How are we going to spend our time, money, and attention? I mentioned a minute ago that every time a group comes together, they have to go back and reform. So you see how these stages happen. So every time we come back together and every time we change in a group, people leave, people join us, we have to reform. So we form, we storm, we norm, and we perform, and we do it over and over and over again. Anybody want to guess where most groups get stuck? So every year, should we do this with committees when a new class comes in? Great question, Christy. Absolutely. Yes. Every time you have this time of year in January, when have new people or people who've rotated off, new people who are joining our teams, we should take intentional time to form. Never assume that everyone knows who else is on their team. So it's critically important to take that time to form with each other. Thank you, Christy, for that question. Wonderful, wonderful question. So again, we have to go back through this every time. Where most groups get stuck is in the storming. Because we oftentimes either avoid the storming. Some of us, how many of us have ever been part of a group, or maybe it's our own preferred pattern, that when storming starts, we just shut down? How many of us have ever been there? Okay. So when the storming starts, we avoid it and we shut down. Other people and other groups, when the storming starts, people do what? Exit scene. All right. If people leave the group because storming happens, what do we have to go back and do? Anybody want to guess? reform. We have to go back and reform. So I have seen many, many groups, and I've been part of many groups, churches, church staff, ministry teams, where we go from forming to storming to forming to storming. And we can't get past there because we cannot figure out how to navigate safely through the storms. Anybody else ever had that experience within your group setting? Okay.
Mine's really recent.
Yeah, really recent, Joy. So
Really recent. And I was proud of myself for addressing it. It took me a little while to do that, but I just had to. It is not like me. I am not a confrontational person, but I said it's got to be done or it's going to ruin the whole thing.
We're going to have to. So hopefully what we're going to be learning together tonight is how do we do that? What are some essential skills and the importance of the role? We're going to focus tonight on the important role of boundaries and helping us navigate through those storms. And hopefully by putting the boundaries in place, in fact, sometimes preventing the storms from ever occurring. Having worked with churches for over 20 years, what we have discovered is that the number one source of conflict in churches is not having clearly articulated and communicated boundaries in place. Churches, friends, are notorious for not having good boundaries. My. You would have thought that maybe we'd never heard about them in Scripture, and yet Scripture is filled with godly boundaries. And yet that's what we have found in our 20 plus years, is that one of the pivotal issues, critical issues for churches, is not having boundaries in place, or the boundaries weren't articulated, or they had not been enforced in healthy ways. So we're going to spend time together tonight talking about that. Let me just pause for a second and say, last year, I don't know if any of you were able to join us for the Equip and Connect training session, what was at that point called Winter Leadership Training. I actually did it on the 7 skills for healthy storming. And I don't know, Katie, you may or may not know if we can access links from last year's training, but Kelly, we can check on that. And if we're able to access the handout and the link, oh, good. Yes, we can. Thank you, John. We might just send that out to all of you as participants in case you would like to go back and watch last year's training session on the 7 skills for healthy storming, because that is not the content we're going to focus on tonight, but we are going to focus on the role of boundaries in navigating through the 4 stages. Okay, that sound good? All right. So where we're going to focus the rest of our time this evening is talking about how boundaries actually serve as the anchor, if you will, in navigating through these storms. Years ago, when I was teaching in Plow Point, actually one of our team members in Plow Point had grown up in a sailing community. She had grown up on sailboats, and she asked me if I had ever heard of a sea anchor. I did not grow up in a nautical background at all, so I had never heard of a sea anchor. A sea anchor, as I understand it, is not it looks very different and functions differently from kind of the traditional anchor that you think of, with the curve and the cross at the top. A sea anchor looks more like a jellyfish, kind of. It floats on top of the surface. And the purpose for a sea anchor is critically important for a vessel, for it to not get tossed and torn apart in the midst of a storm. So one of the ways to think about the purpose of boundaries within our lives is as a sea anchor. It helps to keep us moving forward, to keep our life and ministry afloat, particularly in the midst of turmoil. All right, so we're going really dive in a bit more, but hopefully that will be an image that might be helpful to you. So let's talk some more about the importance of boundaries in navigating through these 4 stages. So what is a boundary? A boundary is that which is put in place. We can go back. Thank you, Kelly. Put in place to protect the integrity and function of the individual parts and the whole. Very broad definition of boundaries. Anything that's put in place to protect the integrity and function of the individual parts and the whole. Now, if you think about it, the human body is made up of boundaries. Some of you know that before I went into full-time ministry, I actually had an earlier career in nursing. And in nursing, working both as an RN and as a family nurse practitioner, I tend to think in terms of the human body. And the human body is basically defined by many boundaries. We are made up of boundaries. Organs are boundaries. The largest of all organs is actually our skin. Do you know that skin is actually an organ? If you think about skin, skin is there to protect the integrity and function of the individual parts of our body and the whole of our body. My first job out of nursing school at UNC Chapel Hill was as a critical care burn nurse in Chapel Hill, the North Carolina Burn Center. And friends, if you want to see the human body in total chaos, violate 80% of this boundary. And one of the things that I discovered very quickly in burn nursing is that the human body cannot survive, much less thrive and grow, without healthy, intact boundaries. A body cannot survive, much less thrive and grow, without healthy, intact boundaries. And the same is true, friends, for the church, the body of Christ. Our churches cannot survive, much less thrive and grow, without healthy, intact boundaries. So we're going to talk very specifically tonight about how do boundaries help protect our integrity and our function and our relationships with one another in the church, and why are these boundaries essential not only for our survival, but also for our thriving in life and ministry together. All right. Let me just pause right there. Any questions in this initial part of our conversation with each other about the role of boundaries, not only in navigating through these stages, but also in our survival and thriving in ministry? Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about when boundaries are effective and when they're not. And by the way, even the human body, do boundaries ever change? Yeah. So we're gonna talk tonight about the importance of boundaries changing with the body. Boundaries do change in our life and ministry as the church. You think about the human body, even skin. It grows and changes and sometimes shrinks back on us again as we grow and change. And the same is true within our life and ministry within the church. We're going to look at several examples of boundaries that are really important in our life and congregations, and the importance of these being reviewed and updated on a regular basis as our life and ministry grows and changes. So just remember that boundaries are not always fixed. They do change, they do modify, and they need to remain healthy and effective and relevant for our life and ministry. So when are boundaries effective for us? Well, the first thing, friends, is we have to establish boundaries. We have to put them in place. I have talked to and worked with so many churches, probably over 2,000 churches in the past, and that's not an exaggeration, in the past 20 years. And I'm amazed how many of us will say, well, yeah, we've talked about doing that, but we've never written it down. Okay. How many of you have ever, it's like, well, yeah, we kind of have that practice, but we've never had that policy. Have you ever heard that? Okay. What that tells me is we've never really established that boundary. So the first key phase for a boundary to be effective is we have to establish it. We have to formally put it in place. I serve on the executive committee of the Board of Ordained Ministry, and in our work together this afternoon, we just had a conversation about, you know what, we've talked about that, but we're not sure we've ever established it. We went back, looked through our minutes, and we said, you know what, when we meet together in the next couple of weeks, we've got to write and establish that policy. So it needs to be a fair and equitable practice among us. That makes sense? But it wasn't effective. We couldn't really say it was an effective boundary because we had never formally established, we never put it in place. First importance of a boundary, it must be formally established. But the second important aspect of boundaries is those boundaries also have to be communicated. Once you establish the boundary, then you have to communicate it. Let me give you kind of a very practical and in hindsight, a bit funny example. It was not funny when it occurred, was it, Kelly? But it is a great example. So our son, James, Kelly and I have two wonderful children. Our son, James, and his wife, Priyanka, live in Boston, and our daughter, Maddie, works and lives in Asheville. But when our son, James, was 14, he was going out for the first time on a date, if you will. And the mother of the girl that he was going on this first date with came and picked them up, and they were going to a ball game and then out to dinner. And he was excited. We were excited for him. And so Kelly and I were sitting up in the living room waiting for James to come home from that first date. And 11 o'clock came and went. 11:30 came and went. 12 o'clock came and went. 12:30 came and went. 1 a.m. came and went. Now, the first thing that I thought, I don't know about you all, can't speak for any other parents in the room, but the first place that I was absolutely convinced is that my son was lying in a ditch somewhere. Now, why is it that we immediately think that something tragic has happened to our child? Okay, so I had James in a ditch, all right? But then the second thought that came to Kelly and me was, if he's not dead, we're going to what? Kill him. Because he knew when his curfew was. And then Kelly and I realized, well, we had established that boundary, but we forgot to do what? Communicate it. We never told him when his curfew was. So it wasn't an effective boundary. We knew exactly when he was supposed to be home, but we had failed to communicate that to him. Now, it's a whole other workshop about why that mother should have known better, but that's another topic for another time. But for this evening, I hope you all get the point that it was an ineffective boundary because we didn't communicate it. Now, as soon as James got home, we said, gosh, how'd you have a good time? But yet we really couldn't be angry with him because he didn't know. We had not established it. We very quickly helped him understand the importance of the curfew, so on and so forth. All right. Boundaries established and communicated. Anyone for whom the boundaries apply, we have to make sure, friends, that we clearly communicate it. The third thing that is essential for effective boundaries is we also have to embody them. In other words, we have to put them into practice. Who must embody the boundaries first? The leaders. We cannot expect others to live within the boundaries if we as leaders are not doing so ourselves. How we lead, others will follow. So it's absolutely essential that as we begin to put boundaries into practice, that we lead by faithful example and we embody life within those boundaries first and foremost. And that leads us to the fourth aspect of effective boundaries is boundaries also then have to be enforced. Inevitably, boundaries will be violated. They will be violated. However, when they're violated, and all of us will violate boundaries at one time or another, but when boundaries are violated, friends, we have to be willing to address the boundary violations, because if the boundary violations are not addressed, then the boundaries cease to be effective at all. And in fact, if boundaries are violated and the violations are not addressed, then chaos will happen. Chaos will ensue. Let's go back to the example of the human body as a boundary. If this boundary is violated, if I have a severe burn to my skin, or if I have a terrible cut or a gunshot wound, and I ignore that, what will happen? Well, disease, disorder, chaos will happen in my body. And if it isn't addressed, it could eventually lead to what? Death. Now, that might seem pretty melodramatic. And yet, friends, I can tell you, and some of us will probably can give witness to when we've been part of a group, even within the life of a congregation, when there was repeated boundary violations over and over and over again. And the dis-ease and dysfunction became so real that that church continued to suffer even to the point of death and closure. I've seen it many, many times, because the other thing is when people begin to see that boundary violations are happening and no one is willing to address it, healthy people will leave because they don't want to be part of the diseased and dysfunctional system. Okay, does that make sense? All right. How many of you have ever experienced this before? Anyone? Have you ever seen this kind of chaos that happens without being willing to address the boundary violations? How are boundary violations addressed with one another? Well, this is an explicit role of the leadership. But also, if we're in covenant relationship with one another, we're going to talk about some of the covenants we enter into within a church. As a covenantal community, you know, it's part of the way we love one another is by gently, but boldly enough, reminding one another of the boundaries and inviting one another to live back within the boundaries. But again, if we live by faithful example, if we've violated boundaries, if we've stepped outside acceptable behaviors, it's important for us as leaders to be the first to say, you know what, I messed up there. Please forgive me. Okay. I was in a conversation with a group within the last, 24 hours where, one of us said, you know what, we really failed on this. Please forgive us. Please forgive me and my part that I had in this, stepped outside the boundaries, acknowledged it so that we could return to our order and function as a group. Okay. So boundaries are effective if we establish them, communicate them, embody them, put them into practice, and then enforce them. All right. Well, let's take a little bit and talk about two essential categories, broad categories of boundaries, two different types of important boundaries in all relationships, but we're going to specifically relate this to the church. Those two categories are functional boundaries and relational boundaries. Part of this comes from, some of you may have read the book years ago by Cloud and Townsend, two Christian psychologists. The name of the book is, no surprise, Boundaries. If you haven't read it, it's an excellent resource. It's one of those that I would recommend. It actually, friends, was life-changing for me when I read Boundaries, probably 22, 23 years ago. We quote Cloud and Townsend a good bit in Longing to Belong and in part of our work with Boundaries there. But they identified these two essential types of boundaries as being functional and relational boundaries. So what are functional boundaries? Functional boundaries define how things work. Who's responsible for what, where, when, and how. Broad categories of functional boundaries would include job descriptions, policies, procedures. As United Methodist, we have this lovely book of boundaries that we refer to as our book of discipline. It's a book of boundaries. It talks about how we make decisions, how we handle property. It does include, job descriptions, expectations of committee members. That is a set of functional boundaries. Example I gave a minute ago of a curfew within our family, that was a functional boundary. How things were to work, who was responsible for what, where, when, and how, was part of that functional boundary. All right. The second category of functional boundaries are what are known as relational boundaries. The broadest category of relational boundaries are covenants or covenantal agreements. They protect and guide our relationship with one another. Examples, just within the church, of some of our relational boundaries are our baptismal vows, our membership vows. Let me just pause. It has always struck me. I love, by the way, Baptismal Renewal Sunday, because I think it is a beautiful opportunity every year in our life and ministry together to renew those relational covenants. Not only our baptismal vows, to go back and to remind ourselves, this is what we promised one another in our baptism. And then our membership vows. They're powerful vows, friends, that we promise to uphold the church through our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, and our witness. It has really struck me over the past several years, what would our life and ministry in the church look like if we truly recommitted ourselves to live within those two sets of vows, our baptismal covenants, to resist evil in all forms in which it presents itself, Our membership vows, to uphold and support the church through prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. How might it change our life and ministry together if we really regarded that more than some Kodak moment and we really embrace what it means to enter into these covenantal relationships with one another? Those are relational boundaries. And I'm not going to ask us to personally give witness to this, but think about the ways in which we've kind of violated those vows, just those vows, how we have not upheld our baptismal vows or our membership vows, and how it might look very differently. Another example of relational boundaries are marriage covenants. Kelly and I, in February, I think it'll be 38 years, right, Kelly, that we've been married with each other and to each other. But we still remind one another of our vows that we took with one another. And because we still take those vows very seriously. One of those vows is we said to one another on February 16th, February 15th, 1986. I do remember our anniversary, I promise, sweetie, is that, and I promise to develop God's gifts in you. I promise to develop God's gifts in you. And friends, that was a relational boundary that we entered into many years ago that changed our life with one another drastically. Because when we were, experiencing very successful careers after moving to Los Angeles, and, Kelly sat up one 4th of July in bed and said, I have got to go to seminary. And we knew that half of our income would be gone. And we had just purchased our first home together in Los Angeles. I knew that I had to say yes to that transition in our lives. Why? Because Kelly and I had taken that vow with one another. It was a relational boundary in which we were living, that I knew that to develop God's gifts in him, I had to say yes to this, and we had to find a way. And then, of course, we did it again when I did the same thing and shifted careers a few years later with ministry. So do you see how those relational covenants, those vows, are to be taken very seriously? We're also going to spend some time in the next few minutes looking at some specific examples of these functional and relational boundaries. All right. Does this make sense? Do you see these two different kinds of boundaries, both functional and relational boundaries? All right. I want us to take just a minute. I'm not going to read through this whole thing for you, I promise. But Kelly's going to put up on your screen and send your handout. It's actually the second page of your handout. This is a sample ministry description of a pastor. All right. What we did is we took the United Methodist Book of Discipline, and what it says in the Book of Discipline, what a pastor is responsible for. And so we just formatted that into just a broad general ministry description for a pastor. And what we have found is that when we work with churches, is if churches that have really clear pastoral expectations, and the pastor and the SPRC, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, agree on those expectations, then it really helps establish that life and ministry moving forward in a much healthier way than if that boundary is not clarified. Years ago, when we started PlowPoint, our experience was that over 70% of the churches that we work with did not have up-to-date, accurate ministry descriptions for their pastor, and if they had other staff, of their staff. One of the resources that we're glad to share with you, and you can just email Kelly if you would like this, is we actually have sample ministry descriptions for many common positions within the local church. So if you would like to begin establishing job descriptions, ministry descriptions, not only for a pastor, but for other positions, youth minister, administrative assistant, choir director, praise team leader, you name it. We have a lot of those that we have just developed over the years, and we would be glad to share those with you. And we just send them to you in a Word document form so that you can edit according to your needs. But again, we have found that much of the conflict that we have experienced within local churches has occurred because expectations have not been clearly defined and agreed upon. And so when, whether it's a pastor or another staff member doesn't meet expectations, if those were not established and communicated, then oftentimes the conflict will emerge. Okay. Any questions about functional boundaries, an example of a ministry description as one of those? Okay. Other examples of functional boundaries, we didn't include this in your handout, but Another common example, policies and procedures. For instance, you'll notice that every year in our charge conference reports, we are asked to submit and to document whether or not we have reviewed and updated our safe sanctuary policies. Okay, why is that so important? It's a functional boundary that must be put in place, reviewed every year. Why do we need safe sanctuaries? Well, it protects the individual parts and the whole. Who does a safe sanctuary policy protect? Everybody. You're exactly right, Laura Lee. It protects the children, youth. It protects those who are working with them. It protects the leadership of the church. It protects the entire church, individual parts and the whole. And if a violation of that boundary occurs, if there's a safe sanctuary violation, who does it threaten? Everyone. Okay, just another example of functional boundaries and why they should be established, but also reviewed on an ongoing basis. I didn't mention this related to job descriptions. The practice that I have embraced over the years and in working with staff parish relations committees and others is that it's really important to review any existing job descriptions on an annual basis. I say that when a job review comes up, prior to the job review, the annual review, I like to send out the job descriptions and say, by the way, take a look at this. Let's just make sure that we update it and make sure it's still accurate and reflects the actual nature of your work at this time. That is really important, especially in this day and time when our work is changing so rapidly. Can I get a witness? Okay. I mean, how many of you had your works like, oh, whoever thought, Kelly, you're talking about, well, just a few years ago, we didn't ever know that we would have to know how to work digital technology and Zoom meetings and or being recording sermons on a weekly basis. But those were very different expectations that only emerged 4 years ago. So if we're not reviewing those on an annual basis, then those boundaries become very ineffective after a while. Okay, so policies and procedures as well as job descriptions. Laura Lee, did you have a question?
I did. Well, it's sort of a comment. I think I recognized this before I became clergy, maybe as a clergy spouse, that I'm not sure that there's any other career, and I know that there's lay people involved in this too, where so I think all of us have to realize our boundaries are so mixed up. As clergy people, and then we transfer some of that to the church, because I think the first time I really felt it deep was when someone questioned my calling. And not only are they questioning my calling, but they're questioning my job. They're questioning everything that I identify as in that way. And even my house, and now our marriage doesn't even have the boundary because I work for him, so.
Yeah. Right.
It gets complicated. And I'm not sure that churches or the lay people understand how hard that is.
Yeah. And, Laura Lee, I appreciate you even bringing up our home environment as a boundary, and it is. And we're going to spend some time as we end this evening, really talking about what I call really the hinge of all boundaries. And we'll kind of come back to this in a minute. But, being able to establish in life as clergy, because when someone says you're available 24/7, well, no, none of us are able to be available 24/7. And I'll never forget my very first appointment. I was attending Candler School of Theology, and Kelly and I were living in central Georgia, right around the Macon area. And we were living in my parsonage, which was a 35-year-old double wide trailer right behind the church. And I will never forget when Kelly had gone to his church early that morning, and our car was in the shop. So I was there at the parsonage without a car, and I got out of the shower and I heard someone in the house. only to realize that one of the trustees of the church had decided to just come on in the house. And been there, Sharon, and it's like, are you kidding me? And had not asked, no idea that anyone was going to be coming into the parsonage. And from their perspective, it was their house. I mean, the church owns the parsonage. Why was I bothered by that? But it was our home. And so, that's just an example of where our boundaries get really blurry sometimes, and it's really important to clarify and articulate those to protect the integrity of our relationships and how we're going to work with each other. It took me a while to reestablish trust there. I mean, I'll be honest, because I felt like that was a major boundary that had been violated. Yeah. Thank you, Laura Lee, for bringing that up. Well, we're going to touch on that again here in a few minutes. All right. I'd like to move us on to another relational boundary beyond the covenants. We've talked some about our membership vows, our covenant, our baptismal vows, wedding vows. I would like us to spend a few minutes talking about the development of relational covenants. Our experience, again, is that every group of people, to be able to navigate effectively and safely through the various stages of life and ministry, it's important for us to have a relational covenant. Sometimes those relational covenants are very simple. Sometimes they're much more exhaustive. It all depends on the needs of the group. It really depends on the needs of the group. I am not going to take you through the next several pages of the handout, but what you'll find on the next 1, 2, 3, 4 pages is we have laid out for you a whole process of establishing a relational covenant, step-by-step process of how you could develop a relational covenant within a church, a ministry team. I will tell you that as a family, our family has had a relational covenant for many years. We developed a relational covenant with our children when they were still fairly young. I'm going to say, older elementary. And of course, it was in terms and in a manner in which they could understand. They had input in developing the covenant. So what do you think is important, Maddie, for us being a happy and a good family with each other? And at the age of 7, she was able to tell us what she thought was important. And so we established a covenant that was essential for us. These steps will help you understand how to begin developing a relational covenant. And then we begin or we end in this particular section by giving you just an example of a relational covenant. Again, you'll see a draft relational covenant there. Please know that this is not how all relational covenants should read. You could just kind of follow the process and see, here's one way in which a relational covenant may come together. Again, we have found this absolutely essential anytime you're working with a group, and particularly as you're coming together as a new group, to develop this relational covenant, expectations that we have of one another, especially how we're going to deal with differences, not if, but when they emerge with each other, will be really important. I want to tell you one more quick story, and that is about our daughter Maddie. And by the way, we used to always ask our children permission before we would tell stories on them, particularly from the pulpit. They finally, about a year or two ago, gave us a blanket permission. They said, you know what, we're not going to be embarrassed anymore. So please feel free to tell any story about us now. You don't have to contact us by text or email to ask permission. So we have permission. John, before I tell this quick story, I want to go ahead and answer your question.
Thank you, Beth. And more of an informational piece, I wanted to just share for those listening. Last night I had an opportunity to help in the facilitation of one of the other sessions on keeping the faith, which is based on work being done out of the Duke Clergy Health Initiative.
Yes.
And just wanted to to let folks know there's a lot of similarities and some good partnership between the materials and the information and the things that you're encouraging us to look at and what's coming out of Keeping the Faith initiative. And so as for awareness, you can look in the Whova app at that information from last night, or once it's posted, you could go back and look at it. The Keeping the Faith booklet that is available also talks about the importance of the conversations between the pastor and leadership within the church. It's particularly focused on the SPRC relationship because of the nature of that partnership there, but could be applied in other areas as well. And it has design facilitation through 6 different critical conversations that would be helpful to have with the pastor. And one of those is, and it all starts with forming this relational covenant.
Yeah.
And so that is another resource that folks may want to look at. They also have as you've provided, a template and a couple of different examples of how different churches have used that covenant, and shared that there's no right or wrong way to do it, right? It's what works for your church. Some will want to maybe have something pretty robust. Now, we didn't get into the, hey, we promise not to come into your house while you're taking a shower segment.
I would not have thought to put that one in either, John. So.
But, one of the examples they had was the people, agreed to say, well, we'll all remain seated. And I thought, well, I don't know what happened at that church before, but but as an example, but anyway, just wanted to kind of make the connection for folks that there's some additional training through this week's events that might be an additional supportive resource to
Right.
help facilitate some of these conversations if helpful.
Thank you, John. That's wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate that. So real quick, this story about our daughter, Maddie. So Maddie was in the 4th grade. She actually, I can't remember what they call it, but she was part of a kind of an experiment within her elementary school where the same group of students would have the same teacher like one year after another. So they had been had the same teacher in the 4th grade and 5th grade. I know there's a name for that, but anyway. So this group of students and this teacher journeyed together for quite some time, and Maddie was part of a group of girls that were very smart, pretty gregarious, and let's just say that in their 4th grade year, by the end of the school year, they could go head toe to toe on some things, and so beginning of their 5th grade year. Maddie came home from school, I don't know, first or second week of school. And she said, told us at dinner one night, I had the group develop a relational covenant today. And we said, you did? And she said, well, yes. She said, during lunchtime, I had everybody sit down and I taught them Longing to Belong. Now, Longing to Belong is the first book that we published in 2004, which we talked about navigating through conflict, how to develop a relational covenant, so all of that. And yes, our children, they used to say, do not quote chapter 7 to us. I mean, we taught them this stuff. So Maddie said, so over lunch, I taught them Longing to Belong. It's like, okay, I used to do it in a 4-hour seminar. My daughter can teach it over lunchtime, but good for her. And then she said, and then during PE, we never do anything really important in PE. So I brought everybody back together and we developed a relational covenant. And then she flipped out a copy of a relational covenant that these 5th grade girls had written in their language. But by golly, it was a covenant. And so we said, well, honey, that's pretty amazing. That's really great. Well, towards the end of that 5th grade year, we saw their teacher, and she said, I just have to tell you, there has been the most remarkable a remarkable change in this group of girls this year. And we said, oh, wow, that's great. That's wonderful to hear. And we said, did did they ever show you what they did at the beginning of the year? She goes, oh, you mean the relational covenant? And I said, yes. She says, oh, yes. Believe me, they had me make copies and we passed it out to the whole fifth grade. And they made sure that all fifth graders lived within the bounds of that relational covenant. And it transformed the whole fifth grade. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is you're like, oh my gosh, I don't think my church will ever be able to do this. I'm like, well, you know what? If a small group of, gregarious fifth grade girls can do this, I'm pretty sure our churches can do it too, friends. But so I'll never forget lunchtime, PE, whole fifth grade transformed. There you go, relational covenants. So, and thank you, John, for reminding us of that other dovetail resource that fits in beautifully. All right. So, really go back, and I encourage you to look at both your functional and relational boundaries that you have in place. Also pay attention to what might be missing. You might want to be thinking about where are those points where we have ongoing contention, and it might be revealing to you where there is a lack of articulated boundaries. It might be revealing to you where you're missing an essential functional or relational boundary that needs to be clarified. And again, if we can help you with that moving forward, reach out to Kelly. We have a lot of resources, and we would be glad to help point you to some others as well. Before we finish up this evening, I want to really point our attention to what I really believe is one of the most, if not the most, essential boundaries for the sustainability of our life and ministry with one another, and just really life in general. And that is reclaiming the boundary of Sabbath. Why is Sabbath keeping an essential boundary? The image that you see in the upper left-hand corner was an image that we developed years ago, I think in 2006, when we launched another aspect of Plow Point called Shepherd Care. That was a holistic wellness program for clergy and their families that looked at the spiritual, physical, and relational health of clergy. And this image that we developed really showed how these different areas of our lives all intersect, but really what is the key that holds our spiritual life, our physical life, and our relational lives together is the boundary of Sabbath. So if you look at the very center, the brown part of this Trinitarian symbol is the boundary of Sabbath. From the very beginning of time, God created all of life to function within godly boundaries, within a God-ordained rhythm that was created to help us maintain healthy functioning and healthy relationships with one another. If you think about the ebb and flow of tides, the rising and setting of the sun, seasons of production and dormancy, these are all boundaries that were established from the very beginning of creation. And God gave us the gift of Sabbath. Not only is it a command, it was a command. The reason it was a command is because God knew just how essential this boundary was going to be for us to be able to maintain the integrity of the individual parts and the whole. So I want us to think about Sabbath from the perspective of both functional and relational boundary for a few minutes. A lot of scripture that relates to Sabbath keeping. One of my favorites is from Exodus chapter 31, where God says, "Tell the people, be careful to keep my Sabbath day, for the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant between me and you from generation to generation." So let's just pause right there. It's a sign of the what? covenant. So do you see where Sabbath was part of the covenantal, okay, the relational covenant between us and God? It is given so you may know that I am the Lord. And I like to parenthetically insert, and by the way, you are not. So that you will know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. What's the purpose of Sabbath? Well, one simplified way to think about Sabbath is it does help protect and restore us physically, spiritually, and relationally. It is the boundary that really protects our physical well-being, our spiritual well-being, and our relational well-being. Laura Lee, you mentioned just a minute ago about, part of the challenge of being a clergy couple, and that, sometimes it's hard where we live our work and our work enters into our home. And, we have to be very careful about honoring the boundary, and so that all of life doesn't become consumed by work. And that's one of the places and times where Sabbath keeping is essential. And by the way, not only is God talking about a weekly Sabbath here, but there's also a daily rhythm of Sabbath. We are to cut it off. There needs to be a time where we say no more for now. And it doesn't mean that it's no more period. It means I really can cut off my computer. I really can step away, so that I am honoring a boundary of when I'm working, when I'm resting, when there's production, and when there's dormancy. Daily, weekly rhythm. Protect and restore us physically, spiritually, and relationally. It defines what we are about, but Sabbath also defines what we're not about. It helps us clarify who is God and who is not. If I'm really honest with myself, friends, when I have struggled with the boundary of Sabbath is when I have let the voice in my head say, well, if I don't do it, ... what's the rest of the sentence? No one else will. Really? When I begin to think that way and act that way, who am I putting at the center of the universe? Me. I'm saying that everything is depending on and rotating around me. And if we're not careful, our refusal to honor and receive the gift of Sabbath is in some forms another form of idolatry. We're placing ourselves at the center of the universe and saying nothing can happen without me. All right. It also defines what we are and not responsible for. In other words, it is to help us remember that God is God and that we are not. And my experience is once I started living back in the boundary of Sabbath, that it helped other people realize what they should be responsible for and really what I'm not responsible for, and helped me be able to let go. I want to just take a brief moment. I'm not going to go into the full story tonight. Some of you have actually heard me tell a much fuller part of this story. If any of you have done the clergy ethics training, the new ministry professional training that's given online in the conference, you've heard me do an expanded part of this teaching. But I think it's important to share because, as I've taught earlier this evening, when boundaries are violated, chaos happens. My name is Beth, and I'm a workaholic, and today is another day of recovery for me. This has been part of my own journey of coming to grips, growing up in a family of addictions, to know that I too struggled with this particular boundary. This was my addiction of work. And I started to see the impact that it was having on my marriage, on my parenting. It also began to not only impact my relationships. I've found that when I refused to honor Sabbath, that it impacted me physically. I had become very unhealthy with my weight. I didn't take any time for self-care. But what was really interesting, friends, is that I also failed to nurture my relationship with God. So I was suffering spiritually. What's most interesting about that is on the outside, people would have just thought I was a highly effective, fast-moving pastor because I was always available and I was working 80 to 100 hours a week. And I honestly did not think it was enough. And it wasn't until I was confronted with this by Kelly, who loved me enough to say, Beth, I think we need to go back and look at this and to get back to a healthy place. And when I began to reclaim the gift and the command of Sabbath, the boundary of Sabbath in my life, is when I came to the realization of a truism that had been shared with me many, many years before, when I was still practicing as a family nurse practitioner and a health administrator. I was actually the health administrator for the city of Glendale in Los Angeles, California. And there was a counselor in town that I referred patients to who would take me out to lunch once a month. And this particular counselor, whose name was Bill, when I graduated with my master's in nursing from UCLA, he gave me this beautiful name tag for my desk. And on one side of the name tag, where people sitting on the other side of my desk would sit, they would see Beth M. Chrisman, RN, MN, FNPC, Health Services Administrator. Beautiful nameplate. On the back side of the nameplate that I would see while I was sitting at my desk were these letters, FMCOUA, and underneath it was written Vince Lombardi. And I said, Bill, this is absolutely beautiful. Thank you for this. What is FMCOUA and who is Vince Lombardi? Well, of course, he had to tell me who Vince Lombardi was, the famous coach of the Green Bay Packers. No, I'm not a professional sports fan. But he told me how Vince Lombardi had many famous sayings, one of which was, fatigue makes cowards of us all. Let me say that again. Fatigue makes cowards of us all. And then Bill looked at me at my ripe old age of 28 and said, Beth, you are really gifted. You're very competent. I think God has an amazing future for you. However, I see you get paralyzed by fear and you start to question yourself when you get tired. You have got to stop and rest, or the enemy is going to control you through your fatigue and weariness. Isn't that amazing? Age of 28, secular world counselor, hit it right on the head. He knew what my greatest stumbling block was going to be in my life and ministry was the inability to stop, rest, and to claim the Sabbath, the gift and the boundary of Sabbath that God had given me, that God has given all of us from the very beginning of time. So friends, I shared this with you. I think this is something we struggle with as ministry professionals. I think it's something we struggle with in our life and as a church. Sometimes I think we struggle in the local church of thinking that we're not effective if we're not doing all the time. And sometimes I think our tendency has been to overschedule not only ourselves, but our families so that we don't know what Sabbath looks like anymore. So part of this is a call to also really stop and evaluate what is the the boundary and the gift of Sabbath look like for the sustainability and the fruitfulness of our life and ministry together. So the last thing that we have on the handout for you are these simple steps for reclaiming Sabbath back as our center and back as an essential boundary. We've just given you some very practical steps of how to reclaim Sabbath on a daily rhythm, how to take Sabbath moments throughout the day, and how to set aside sacred space and time where you can truly be still and to experience, even if it's throughout the day, what Sabbath space and time looks like. Name and articulate, what are the greatest fears and obstacles for why you don't honor Sabbath? What are you afraid of? Sometimes I think we have to name it and claim it so that we can begin to work in an accountability relationship with others, to begin overcoming what is keeping us from truly honoring the gift of Sabbath. Decide what day is your Sabbath and put it on your calendar as the most important appointment commitment that you have for that week. Name it, claim it, do the best you can to protect it, knowing that there are always, this isn't to be legalistic, friends, and as a pastor, throughout my 25 plus years, there have been many, many times where, I have had a crisis within the church, a family, a death. And of course, I set that aside. I set aside my Sabbath. I come out of those Sabbath moments to be fully present. Jesus was very clear, that that Sabbath isn't to control us. Okay, it's a gift, and there are times where we do work in the midst of our Sabbath to tend to the needs of others. What I'm encouraging us to do is not from a legalistic perspective, but in fact, to be able to think about the discipline of how to reclaim this boundary, and then identify distractions that keep you from resting. For me, it was electronics. For many years, when I started reclaiming the gift of and boundary of Sabbath in my life, we would drape my laptop in black on our Sabbath as a way, to basically help me remember I don't want to go there, because I knew if I went there just to check a few emails, that it was a black hole. Over time, I found that wasn't as much the black hole for me as it was. But you have to decide what that is for you. And then the seventh simple practice and step that we've listed here is really leaning into, I think, one of our historical gifts, and that is John Wesley's covenant prayer, that I think reminds us of this balance of who we are, whose we are, what we are to be about, what we're not to be about, and what it means to let go and to trust God enough, knowing that we are ultimately God's. So I would love, as we're ending our time together, and I will open us back up for questions after we do this, but I would love us to say, and then I'll just ask you to keep yourself muted, otherwise we get that strange cacophony. But I would love us to say John Wesley's covenant prayer with one another as one of the ways that we go forth with blessing this evening, but also a way of reclaiming what this covenant means for us. Can you all see it well enough on the handout? Or Kelly, I don't know if you want to switch and put up that last slide, if you can do that for us. So it might be a little easier to read if some of us don't have the handout present with us. And so Kelly's going to pull up that last piece. I should know this prayer by heart. It's one of my favorite. How many of you have been familiar with Wesley's covenant prayer? When I have pastored local churches, this was always for me one of the most important things to do at the beginning every year in that baptismal renewal service, is to say Wesley's covenant prayer with one another. Kelly, it's too tough. do most of you able to see it? And we can put it back up. Here we go. There we go. Thank you, Kelly. All right. Lord, make me what you will. I put myself fully into your hands. Put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and with a willing heart give it all to your pleasure and disposal. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Well, friends, I would love to open it up to any other questions or other things that we would like to share as a group in our last few minutes as we finish up with each other.
Talking about functional boundaries.
Yes, sir. Yes.
It's I don't use much social media, and I am friends with many pastors and colleagues, and I receive a lot of invitations to be friends with members of the congregation. Honestly, I am a little reluctant to that. What would be an advice on doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Hugo. And obviously there are a lot of different practices and preferences that people have related to engagement with social media. When people ask me about Facebook, Instagram, other different platforms, I actually, how I respond to that, Hugo, is that, I do not engage much on social media. It's a boundary issue for me. And that's how I respond to it, Hugo. And I say, it's not so much about you, it's about me. I know myself well enough that if I begin engaging in that way, I have a hard time cutting it off. And there are oftentimes on social media that things that are not healthy for me to engage in. And I find it can be a black hole for me. And so just know that that's not going to be a platform that I engage. I would love to connect with you. Feel free to call me. Feel free to email me. Feel free to text. Let's get together for coffee. But that's just it's not a platform that I engage in. And so I think that that's very personal. I think, Michelle, you might have shared that you don't have to be friends with everyone. And, some people have other ways of setting boundaries within those platforms. And my experience has been, Hugo, when I go into a church, I just kind of let people know that up front, that it's not personal. It's not that I don't want to be friends with you. This is more about a boundary issue for myself. And it's one of the things I've learned about myself over the years. I really want to be in a healthy relationship with you. And that's just not the best means by which I have been able to do that in the past. Yeah. Great question. Thank you, Hugo. Others, any other comment or question? Yes, Ruth Ann. And Ruth Ann, and then Sharon will go to you. There we go.
Okay, there you go. I am the new lay leader at a church that we have just moved, and we're at a church where I'm the new lay leader, and I'm really struck. Well, first let me say that in my career, I use the Tuckman model to train with all the time. I love it. I used it with my family.
Yeah.
It's just fabulous. But I am in a situation where I'm now taking this position as lay leader, and the couple that have been in the church for a long, long time have done no planning. There was no council meeting at all last year. And I'm trying to decide how to move into this without causing an eruption, if you know what I mean. And I wondered if you had any advice on that. I'm really struggling.
Sure. And, and Ruth Ann, we can talk more offline at some time if you want to email me or Kelly, and we can, kind of talk through that more. But particularly as you're coming in, and how I would suggest is, I'm new. I'm new in this role, new in the church. I'm trying to learn the rhythms and patterns and the expectations of leaders within your church. Help me understand, what is our regular meeting schedule? I want to know that I'm prepared. Just help, if you can share with me what your practices are. I say that the first skill of healthy storming that in our teaching last year, seek first to understand. Help me understand. I'm new. I want to make sure that I honor expectations. And then once you learn what is in place, Ruth Ann, and what's not in place, then you can say, gosh, thank you for sharing this. I'm curious, how do we move forward with the ministries of the church if we're not meeting on a regularly scheduled basis? So again, yep, you just kind of, and that way you can help explore the expectations, but you begin with letting them tell you what they have been up to this point. Thanks, Ruth Ann. Sharon.
In reclaiming your Sabbath, and even the constant, it for me, it's a constant. Did you find that the rest of the days of the week just got longer at first in order to compensate for the fact that you've reclaimed this day, or did you just find yourself more efficient and effective on the days you were working?
So what was interesting is over time, I really found my effectiveness was so much greater because I actually was rested and I was able to focus more. I find the same is true when I take a daily Sabbath rhythm. As crazy as it sounds, to get up and set aside that first time at the beginning of the day, the rest of my day flows so much more smoothly and I'm so much more effective. I find that same thing is true. When I find I start to unravel, Sharon, is when I have been, and I was talking to Kim, our administrator here in the URA district today, because I looked at my calendar, and sometimes, guys, Fridays are our Sabbath now. There are things that get scheduled on Fridays that just, for us as cabinet, that we can't avoid. And so I've got 2 weeks in a row where I've got things on Fridays, and I know myself well enough to know this is not going to lead to a pretty pattern. I'm going to get so tired, I'll cease to be effective. And so, I have, Kim said to me today, Beth, I notice you've got time available tomorrow. Are you going to take time off tomorrow? And I said, Kim, that's a great idea. I am. I'm not going to come in. I'm not going to come in tomorrow. I might do a few things from home. If you need me, you know where to find me. So you have to know yourself well enough in your rhythm, but it takes some time to settle into the new patterns. But I truly live by it. I and Kelly is my witness. It makes all the difference in our family because if Mama ain't rested and happy, you don't know how to finish out the rest of that. But yeah, thanks, Sharon. It's a great question. All right, we might have time for one more real quick question, but I want to honor. We need to finish up by 7:30, and I believe in honoring the boundary of time. I don't see any other hands raised. No, friends, that again, please email us. You've got Kelly's email, my email. We are more than happy to continue in conversation with you and to help resource you in whatever way we can. We have recorded this evening's session, so there will be the recording of this and of course the handout. Feel free to share that with others because we want this to help enrich your ministry as you move forward, and we are here to support and journey with you in whatever ways we can. So thank you all so much. We are grateful for your gift of time and presence. Thank you.